Hello, and welcome to the Danville Museum of Fine Arts and History in the Sutherlin Mansion. We are now in the front parlor of the Sutherlin Mansion. The Sutherlin family were the only family ever to live here in the house, and Mrs. Sutherlin, her husband, and their daughter, we know had moved in by 1859. We do know that they were living on Wilson Street, and their house there had a fire in 1858, and so they probably moved in soon after that fire. But here over the piano, we have a portrait of Mrs. Sutherlin. This is most likely her wedding portrait that was done in 1849 when she married William Thomas Sutherlin of Danville and Sutherlin, Virginia. This portrait was painted by William Gall Brown Jr., who was a well-known painter in the second half of the 19th century, well known for painting the aristocrats of the southern states. Also here in the room we have a portrait of the Sutherlin's daughter. We also refer to her as Janie II. We know that this was her wedding portrait that was painted in 1873. Back over to the piano, sorry, Wynn, we have a photograph of the Sutherlin's granddaughter, who was also married here in the front parlor in 1895. And her daughter, in the small photograph, was also married in this room in 1923. That was after the city acquired the property. After Mrs. Sutherlin's death in 1911, there was a developer that was interested in purchasing the property. He would have demolished the house and subdivided the land. The organization, then known as the Ladies Memorial Association, rallied their forces, creating the Danville Confederate Memorial Association, which acquired the property in 1912. And like so many nonprofit organizations, they had a very good initial fundraiser and were able to make a down payment on the property. However, as the years passed, they were barely able to keep up with their mortgage payments. So by 1916, they had convinced the city of Danville to take over the property. So the city of Danville now has owned the property for 104 years. However, the museum is a separate nonprofit organization, and we lease the building from the city. So back to the front parlor. This was the fanciest room of the house where the Sutherlins would entertain their most important guests. We have the turtle table here, the marble top table, that is in the Rococo style. It is an original Sutherlin piece that they would have furnished this room with when the house was completed. Also in this room we have the sofa, also of the Rococo style. Prior to the museum acquiring this sofa, the previous owner had actually used it as the headboard for a bed. Also in this room we have the étagère, or whatnot stand, that is also an original piece that is on loan to the museum. Additionally, the ruby glass luster was owned by the Sutherlins, as was the alabaster compote on the mantelpiece. The portrait to the left of the étagère is the Sutherlin's granddaughter. Her mother, the Sutherlin's daughter, died here in the house with complications of childbirth upon delivering her second child, which also died. At that time, the Sutherlins decided to raise their granddaughter, who had been born here in the house, as they had raised their daughter here as well. And she lived in the same bedroom upstairs where her mother had grown up. Also in this room we have the fancy side chairs, one of which we believed had belonged to the Sutherlins. And if you will notice the fancy plaster work at the ceiling, the crown molding in here was created in place. Now all of the individual decorative pieces you see would have been precast before the installation. The linear portions were created in place, and then the decorative pieces were placed onto that while it was still wet. Now similarly, the ceiling medallion above the converted gasolier was created by putting a bed of wet plaster on the lath, which had been nailed to the ceiling joists. Then all of the individual components of the medallion were placed on that bed of wet plaster. Medallions did actually have a practical purpose. A gasolier like this would have burnt coal gas, which is much dirtier than the natural gas we're used to today, and it would have produced a great deal of soot that would deposit on your ceiling. And if you had a perfectly flat ceiling, it would be near on to impossible to keep it looking clean. Whereas if you had an elaborate ceiling medallion like this, it would be easy enough to dust off the soot from the high points, and any soot that did deposit back in the recesses would simply enhance the design so you didn't look like you had a dirty ceiling.